Today I'm going to show you how to remove a radiator from your heating system, whether you're doing it for decorational purposes or you just want to remove the radiator altogether. You can remove the radiator as a homeowner or a DIY expert without requiring any qualifications, and it's pretty straightforward to do so without upsetting the rest of your heating system. So I'll show you that now. Tools that we need for this job is quite simple and basic really. We have spanner and grips to disconnect the valves. We have a bleed vent to open and close the bleed vent on the radiator. Got two compression caps for capping the radiator when we remove it, and another method here to cap the thermostatic radiator valve, which includes a very nifty trick with a 5p coin, which you got to stick around to see.
Right, so we're going to turn off both sets of radiator valves by turning them clockwise. Thermostatic control is pretty straightforward to turn down. You can see it's on 0 there, or your control might go to a frost mark, but once it stops, that means that particular valve is shut. The water supply from the rest of the system is not going into the radiator, so it stops here. So it means we can work from this side onwards without affecting the rest of the system. And the same thing goes on the other side of the radiator. This is the lock shield valve. We want to be turning this down all the way till it closes and stops clockwise. It's not going to let any water through the opposite side of the radiator, so it means we can work from this side onwards. We're going to disconnect these nuts and drain the radiator down. Right, so I'm going to use what they call a plumb tub. Got these little markings on the outside which you can wrap around the pipe, which are quite useful. But as a homeowner, it's unlikely you're going to have a plumb tub, but you can catch it in anything really, as long as it's shallow and we can get it below this nut, like a paint tray or a roasting tin or whatever you feel is suitable. And then that way we can undo this nut with the adjustable spanner. You can use a 24mm spanner if you have one. It's also a good idea to support the valve with a set of grips and then undo this nut. So we're just going to release the excess water. Just take the pressure off the radiator initially. As you can see, that's pretty much stopped dripping now. So what I'm going to use is an Aquavac, and I'm going to remove this valve and suck the contents of the radiator out with the vacuum cleaner. But as a homeowner, you may not have that, so you could continue to catch whatever's in the radiator just by undoing the valve like that. You see it's stopped coming from this side of the system, and we're just draining the contents of the radiator here. Might be a wise idea to have a big bucket on hand, and you can keep emptying this tray into the bucket until you've emptied the radiator. So if you're doing plumbing on a regular basis in other people's properties, customers' properties, and a lot at home, then I would recommend getting an Aquavac or a wet and dry vac, which allows you to suck water at the same time. Wicks do one for I think about £60, and this is a bit more of a premium model. It's made by Pneumatic, who do the Henry Hoovers. So this was probably more like £150, but if you're doing any sort of wet work, this will suck it up and make the job 10 times easier. So I'm going to actually put the hoover on the end of the pipe that's still dripping into the tray, and when I do that, I can open up the bleed vent at this side of the radiator, which is going to allow air into the radiator and the contents to drain. And then once it's fully drained, I can safely remove the radiator. At the point this tail here stops dripping, we know we've drained the radiator. So at that point, what I would recommend doing is tightening the bleed vent again, because we're going to lift this radiator off the wall and turn it upside down, because there's likely to be still some bits of water left in, and usually in radiators you're going to have dirty water, so it's a good idea to make sure we're not going to spill anything. We go to the opposite side of the radiator. Now we know it's drained down. and disconnect. And now we know this radiator is good to lift off the wall. Just to be sure that I've got as much out of this radiator as possible, I'm going to put the water vac on the end and lift the opposite side of the radiator up just to drain down what may be still left in the bottom of the radiator. But again, if you don't have a water vac, a paint tray or something, you know, a bucket that you can catch whatever may be left in the radiator would be beneficial but not essential. So just a little bit of advice here, especially if you're working on carpets, is I would advise to cap the radiator as we remove it from the wall. And you can do this by, if you buy two 15mm compression caps, they look like this, and then you remove the nut and the olive, you're left with the cap itself, and that will then screw onto the nut and olive, which is attached to the tail, which is still stuck inside the radiator. If we do this on both sides, put the cap on, really only has to be finger tight, and we'll do the same at the other side, and that means when we lift the radiator off the wall, there's going to be no water that comes out of either end of the radiator. Just a handy little tip there. The way I like to remove them is to get my hand under the front here. Be helpful if you've got some gloves, actually that would make it easier. And then I'm gonna lift it up, you lift it away like this, and then turn it upside down. So the grills are on the bottom is my preferred method. If there's no grills, it doesn't really matter. And now I can slide it around on the towel, and I'm going to put it to one side until I finish working on this part of the system. So it's very important to cap your thermostatic radiator valve. If this radiator has been removed for a while, and especially if it's cold, if you're in the middle of winter, these have a tendency to open and they will start trickling here, which is going to affect the rest of your system. So I'm going to tell you this really cool trick where you can cap it yourself by not really, we're just fixing it with what you will have around the house, I would imagine. And otherwise, if you're a plumber, we've been known to do this trick in the past or currently, is to get a small piece of copper pipe, some sort of end cap. Speed fit end cap is very easy, you can just push it on the pipe. And then you just need a simple nut and olive, which you would have actually got if you purchased the compression cap ends before the job, then you will have used the cap for the radiator and you'll have a nut and olive spare. So you can use that nut and olive to cap the thermostatic radiator valve, and you just pop it in here and tighten it up with the spanner. Just wants a little nip there, and it's going to start, if this does open, especially if you have a frost setting as well, it will have a tendency to open ever so slightly, and it will start leaking and you'll lose pressure on your system. So yeah, it's important to do that. If you don't have those, like I said, I've got a really nifty trick to do this, which was once taught to me by a customer actually. And again, the nut that you would have spare from the compression cap, you can use that. Take a 5p piece and drop it in the bottom of the nut, which is going to look like that. And then put a flat 1/2-inch rubber washer. This is the same washer you use for a shower hose. So you could just drop that in the bottom in front of the 5p like this. And it's that rubber that's going to seal against this thread here. And we're just going to tighten that on. And the 5p just acts as a plate to press the rubber against the thread. And again, hand tight. And if you do want to just nip it up with the spanner, to be careful not to crush the rubber. So it just wants a small nip like that with the spanner. And that's not going to leak. If I open this now, you can see that it's not going to leak. Yeah, so that's that. Hope that's helped.